singular art form informed basically every subsequent genre of music in the United States. Its impact cannot be overstated. To give you some sense of this, I'm talking about blues, soul, funk, jazz, R&B, hip hop, drum and bass, techno, funk, house, electro, like the amount of genres that came as a result of spirituals, or the genres that spirituals then created, it's basically every single genre of music that came since then in this country, especially. So it is everything from bebop to disco, hip hop to techno, blues, rock, jazz, all of this, every little bit of it can be traced back to the spiritual. The composer Alice Parker once reflected that man's inhumanity to man should often produce great art is one of the biggest mysteries of the human spirit. The history of spirituals is a history of oppression. We enslaved our brothers and sisters for 12 generations, I did the math, which is an astonishing amount of times the word great must precede grandparent before finding a blood relative whose life was not held in the white man's fist. So it should not come as a surprise to us that spirituals challenge us in many ways. Spirituals are also called, well, they were originally called sorrow songs. There are about 5,000 of them in existence that we know of today, and all of them were written by anonymous poets, musicians whose names we will never know because they were slaves. As you may have guessed, these are all pieces of music that passed down through the oral tradition. They were never formally notated, so it's really kind of hard to study them for many reasons. But one of them is that there's just so little record. We don't know a lot about the religions of African peoples in the 1800s, but we do hypothesize is that they shared a common belief, which is the belief in a single supreme deity. So unlike the Europeans who connected to God through a vast catalog of saints, their connection was through the ancestors, which was very different. One of my favorite experts on the spirituals is the late, great Joe Carter. Some of you may have heard of him. He was a singer and a music educator and ambassador. He died very young at the age of 57 from leukemia quite a few years back. And anyway, Carter's understanding is that when African peoples were enslaved, they were ripped apart from one of the most important elements of their religious beliefs, which was the connection to the land of their ancestors. The divine was reached by connecting to their ancestors from the very soil on which they lived. They lost all of this when they crossed the ocean. They lost all of this and so much more. So Carter explains further that although the early slaves were certainly not impressed with the religion of their masters, they were able to see the blatant hypocrisy of this so-called Christian behavior. They were, however, intrigued by this character named Jesus. You see, here was a man who was born into terrible circumstances, who was mistreated, who was beaten, who was finally killed at the hands of his abusers, yet he was the son of the high God. So the life of Jesus was, for them, relatable. Our understanding is that these early slaves experienced God as being extremely holy and also extremely busy. But if you sang fervently enough, you could also commune in some capacity with God. You may already know, probably some of you already know, that the language of spirituals is a coded one. Every tune had hidden meaning, secret sharing, freedom seeking, from a very broad religious sense to an extremely logistical, practical one. I'm talking about lyrics that are literally intending to teach slaves how to escape, literally offering up the information that they need to escape. You may recognize this tune. Let's see if my keyboard works on this. Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here. I don't know if you can tell, but there's a keyboard behind me right there. Do you recognize that song? How many of us recognize that song? Everybody recognize, hey, participation. Yes, everybody recognizes that song. To my understanding, I think the choristers, Enid, you'd have to correct me on this. I believe the choristers sang an arrangement of this, or like last year at some point. Yeah. Gorgeous song.
They sing it all the time.
They sing it all the time. Fabulous. Beautiful song. This tune is called Steal Away. The refrain is green trees are bending, poor sinner stands a trembling. What is that about? Well, it's literally someone shaking tree branches on the other side of the river, signaling an escape. That's the green trees that are bending. So it's still a way to freedom, literally, quite literally. We often hear references of the River Jordan, for example, but they're not actually about the River Jordan. It's about the Ohio River, right? We also hear references to chariots, to moving feet, to calls to be ready. These are lyrics that are literally meant to inform others about escape plans. Dr. Horace Clarence remarks, the spirituals are religious, but only about 50 to 60%. The rest is instructional. There is so much hope as well as darkness in these tunes. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, which you may know. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. This song is symbolic of death. So like many others, this was a death song, wanting death over life in captivity. It was also frequently sung after a child died. God will bring me a golden chariot. There will be dignity for me. There will be dignity for my deceased child. And if you get there before I do, how does it go? Tell all my friends I'm coming too, right? I talked once with the composer Tom Trenny, who some of you may recognize that name. He's pretty fabulous. I talked with him about his experience learning spirituals and the songs behind them. And I remember him sitting down with me and very earnestly telling me that once he actually really sat with the lyrics for Soon I Will Be Done with the Troubles of the World. Soon I will be done with the troubles of the world. He could never sing it the same way again. He could never sing it really quickly and flippantly as it's so often done. Soon I will be done with it. This is talking about death. This is talking about death, wanting dignity and salvation and final liberation on the other side. Joe Carter talks about a story he heard from an older African-American woman. Her name's Jessie Anthony, about Emancipation Day. Remember, all of these stories, much like the songs that they're about, have been passed down by word of mouth for generation after generation after generation. So Jessie Anthony tells this story on what the slaves assumed would be Emancipation Day. The town emissary, what does he do? He comes over by boat to share the news with the slaves, who are anxiously waiting with bated breath about this news, to hear the news of emancipation. On an island off the coast of South Carolina, the slaves are hushed and they're waiting. And as the boat gets closer, they notice that his facial expression is one of sorrow. And they realize, much to their dismay, that the day has not yet, in fact, come for them. So an older woman in the crowd stands up and begins wailing and singing, "Nobody knows the trouble I've seen," right? "Sometimes I'm up, sometimes I'm down. Oh, yes, Lord, sometimes I'm almost on the ground. Oh, yes, Lord." She's singing from a place of solidarity, deep solidarity that I will never know, to the people, for the people, with the people. And it's this communal expression of sorrow in the highest form. Again, the slaves were people who came from Africa, and they found solace and hope in the son of the high God, who was also held captive, who was also persecuted, also whipped, also chained. There's a fabulous setting of We Shall Walk Through the Valley in Peace. Has anybody heard that one? That's a little lesser known. Yeah, a little lesser known. There's a fabulous setting of it by Moses Hogan, who's probably the most significant composer and arranger of spirituals. And I've found, unfortunately, very few gospel and spiritual arrangements in our choral library at Trinity so far, but we do have this one. We do have this one, and I really hope that our choirs can sing it someday, because it's so fabulous. I'm so glad we have this one. And the setting is, in my opinion, just as rich as the text that it holds. And it says, "There will be no trials there. There will be no trials there. For Jesus himself will be our leader. We shall walk through the valley in peace." What does it mean to be led through the valley? What does it mean to follow a leader who himself was oppressed? Wade in the Water, I played a piano arrangement of this morning. Let's see, what key did I play it in? I can't remember what key I played it in. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. This is a song. Well, there are many theories about this song. And again, so many of our understandings of spirituals are exactly that. They're just theories. But there are many theories about it and its message of salvation, because obviously in scripture, as you all probably know better than I do, there are so many references to water symbolizing transformation, water symbolizing healing. The slaves also sought freedom through river passageways because water masked their scent from the dogs. So there's a connection that could be made here to the teachings of Jesus. Do you want to be healed? All right, then take up your bed and walk with me through the river, right? There's also this message of self-sufficiency, of self-sufficiency, sung by strong people of a great faith, a faith which, despite unimaginable hardships, prevented them from seeing themselves as victims. There are some things you simply will not find in spirituals as a genre. You won't find any whining. You won't find any mean-spirited sentiments. You won't find any victimizing or criticizing. These are the most noble expressions of our Christian faith. It was, Joe Carter explains this, and it always just absolutely gets to the core of me. It was Mammy who took care of the master's baby, not the wife of the household, right? She could have smothered or killed that child, but she didn't. She didn't do that because her faith said, no, you have to be loving. God requires you to be loving. God requires you to be kind. There are no excuses. So this is the oppressed raising the oppressor's child and holding on to dignity and sharing these songs with that child too, as lullabies. There are so many layers to this that we just really can't fathom. They're more than just church songs, right? I'm about to use Joe Carter's exact words here and now to express the next song, because his words are so much more powerful than anything I could say or sing. And it's about the song, it's me, oh Lord, standing in the need of prayer. How many of us know that one? It's me, oh Lord, standing in the need of prayer. Hallelujah, Lord, it's me. Right. So he explains, and I quote, now you find a song like this. It's me, oh Lord, standing in the need of prayer. Not my brother, not my sister, but it's me, oh Lord. Not the preacher, not the deacon, but it's me, oh Lord. Not the doctor, not the lawyer, not the master. Wait a second. These are people who were victims. They were in the midst of a most horrible situation, and they said, I am taking responsibility for who I am today, and it's me standing in the need of prayer. I'm the one with the proud heart. Come and fix me. End quote. I would be remiss, of course, if I didn't also mention another really important scriptural tie, which is, of course, the story of Exodus. Go Down Moses, a song that I assume many of us know and love. How does it go? Go down, Moses, way down to Egypt land and tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. How do you think the slaves experienced this story? There are so many stories. There are so many songs, every single one of them with a rich history, many of which we're only guessing at and picking up from all these pieces that were handed down from generation to generation. And one of the greatest ironies, one of the greatest sort of weirdnesses to all of this is that slave masters were really happy to hear them singing. Why? Because they could tell exactly where they were and that they weren't escaping because they were singing. In fact, masters used to encourage singing, all the while staying completely oblivious to the meaning behind these songs. This was cleverness on many levels. These slaves were not, in fact, singing for the masters, of course. They were singing for each other. They were singing for themselves. So they outsmarted the masters. And this kind of mental strength is also really evident in the necessity that they had to have imaginations. And I mean that as a quite serious thing. I mean, imagination is a quite serious thing, because to live in the land that they did at the time that they did in the way that they did, they had to find ways to keep the faith and to imagine the kingdom of God. They had to keep this inner dignity and inner freedom of soul. So just as I can never truly understand the depth behind spirituals, as I have not lived the life they resulted from, just as I don't believe music to be a universal language, but universally experienced, there is suffering everywhere. Even the most privileged among us, those born into freedom and prosperity and opportunities at education, there is suffering still. None of us are immune to suffering, and none of us can escape it while we're on this earth. So if you go to churches in Scotland, if you go to churches in South Korea, you'll find spirituals in their hymnals. This is someone else's song, anonymously written, centuries removed, situationally very different. But you can hear someone singing, "Sometimes I feel like a motherless child," to someone who doesn't speak English, but they will likely understand the emotional tone and the depth of that melody. Spirituals took on a whole new meaning during the civil rights era, of course, when Martin Luther King Jr. reintroduced them through a new lens of liberation. I think of Dorothy Cotton, the civil rights leader, adapting the lyrics of "Have you got good religion?" Certainly, certainly, Lord. "Are you registered to vote?" Certainly, certainly, Lord. I ran my notes by a friend of mine last night who reminded me of the Harlem Renaissance as well in the early 1900s and the celebration of Black culture and Black music that is so much more than the lamentations of slavery and collective trauma. And so it's also about the celebration of spirit, the lifting up of strength and soul. There's like so many things we could talk about right now, you guys. We could talk about the rise of jazz, which stemmed directly from spirituals and its tremendous impact on American culture. We could talk about the intersection of Black culture and LGBTQ culture and the influence of Black music in the early club scene in Chicago and Detroit and New York. We could talk about how white churches began to include spirituals in their hymnals and different denominational approaches to this kind of musical inclusion. There is so much more depth that we could go into right now. And it's hard to kind of pick where to go from here as I kind of close out my talk. But I think for the remaining minutes of my time, if I haven't totally bored you yet, I'd like to share something which I think is a little hard to talk about, but I believe it to be very necessary. Also, I love ending speeches on a thinker note, on many of them, hopefully. But I believe it's really necessary for us to also recognize the smallness of the lens through which we have historically and still do experience music, the lens through which we understand and assess music. Because, and I'm fascinated by this, we are just beginning to, right now in 2021, just beginning to address the reality of whiteness and how we teach and understand music. Chances are, many of you have been exposed to some kind of music education in your lives, whether it was singing in a choir, taking private lessons, taking music classes in school. Raise your hand if you had some kind of music education. Every single one of you. Look at that. So you were probably taught about major and minor scales. You're probably taught about chords and triads, all these sort of building blocks that are taught in every class of music theory and music history and training, ear training and oral training and orchestration, all these sorts of things. We call this music theory. The theory of music theory. But really, it could be more accurately titled the harmonic style of 18th century white, male, straight European musicians. We don't call it white music theory. We don't call it Western music theory. We don't call it 18th century music theory. We just call this music theory. And so in teaching it as such, we're making this huge unspoken assumption that all music should be understood through this really limited racist lens. What we think of as music theory actually does a really bad job at describing most music across the globe, and also a really bad job at valuing it. Now, if you're thinking if in your heads, you're probably thinking many things right now, and maybe you're thinking something along the lines of, okay, yes, all right, Michelle, I get the spirituals are really important and really beautiful, but Mozart and Beethoven are still the greatest composers to ever have lived. And the musical style that originates from these straight white Western European men between 1700 and 1930 is still really the best in the world and should be taught as that. I encourage you to look a little deeper. Is that what you believe because it's the only thing you were exposed to? Do you consider that music to be high art and therefore more culturally significant than any other? Is it because the only lens through which you were taught to appreciate music is that of the 18th century straight white European male composers? So don't get me wrong. I absolutely believe that Bach and Beethoven deserve seats at the table. In fact, I mean, this is the stuff that I studied too. I went to music school. And I just don't think they should have the whole table. So assuming I haven't absolutely terrified you guys and that in some future date I would be invited to do another adult forum, I assure you that I would gladly lead something on Bach chorales, for example. I love that stuff and I would love to lead something on Bach chorales. I argue that music is not a universal language, although it may be experienced universally. It's only understood through the lens of culture and by extension, what that culture chooses to value. So I could have a whole other conversation about, for example, how limiting and unhelpful the term classical music is. I have very strong feelings about that, but we'll save that for another day. How does this apply to our understanding of spirituals? Well, if we put spirituals through this lens, if we put this genre exclusively through the lens that we're taught through all these different forms of music education, both historical and current to this day, this is how we teach music, a lens that emphasizes the supremacy of white composers of a very specific time and of very specific countries, and open our eyes to nothing else, what would we conclude about spirituals? Well, the lyrics are really repetitive and they're vernacular. So, I guess they're not as poetic or as refined as that of Wagnerian opera. The chord structures, they're really simple, maybe just like 3 or 4 chords. So, guess it can't hold a candle to those harmonic complexities of Bach. Well, they're not really notated, right? So they're kind of common. There's no nuance in orchestration or indication of dynamics or phrasing. So, gosh, it must not be very important or good or worth studying. How foolish and small-minded we would be to experience spirituals like this. I think the American spiritual is one of the most profound genres of art, and I am honored to be able to participate in the playing and singing of them when given the chance and when it is appropriate to do so. And I'm honored to talk about them as a musician, understanding that I will never truly know the experience that caused them to be born, or how it really feels to be singing them from that perspective, generations removed. I also don't really know how to conclude this talk. So I hope you're still with me. I hope some of this was interesting for you. I haven't been to an adult forum yet, so I don't know how this is in comparison to other ones that you've done, but this has been really enjoyable for me to really dig a little deeper into this and then share some of the things that I think about and that I've found on these topics, as it is such a rich tradition. Dee, is there anything? Oh, is this like, do you typically take questions or something?
Yeah, I was gonna say, typically we kind of
okay.
open it for discussion, questions. Folks to know I did start recording, so I didn't want to miss this. So I recorded Michelle's talk. I can either leave the recording on for the Q&A part or turn it off. If you start to share and you want it turned off, then please let me know. Otherwise, I'll just keep the recording going. So the floor is open for any kind of, reflection on how it hit you. I think Susan Tan went up first. So Susan, you can go ahead and go.
It's interesting that growing up until a certain age, I was raised in a fundamentalist tradition. And these hymns, these songs were prevalent in that environment. However, the environment was, white. It was, probably pretty racist. I know my grandparents were. And I'm wondering if this is pure cultural appropriation, or if there was some other reason that these songs, these very powerful songs, were attractive to that particular set of Christians, of white people, It seems incongruous, but I'm very familiar with a lot of the hymns, songs in Levis, for example. And I'm just curious about those things. Do you have any idea?
Yeah, I don't know if that's a question I should necessarily answer. But that is something that I've thought of too. It is, I'm from Florida. Actually, Dee and I were commenting on this before the service began, that so many of us in church leadership right now at Trinity are from the South, from Georgia, from Alabama, and from Florida specifically. And I also grew up in a variety of what I would consider now to be quite conservative traditions, church traditions, and they would sing all these spirituals as well, and they were predominantly white. It that is a really fascinating thing to talk about. Oh, Kitty is reminding us in the chat that spirituals also influenced country music and rock and roll. Yes, they did. Thank you for that, Kitty. I appreciate that.
And it's also, sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
If I can jump in. And just a reminder that Levis isn't all spiritual, so that there are hymns in Levis that aren't spiritual, that are common among Christian traditions.
Right.
So that's also just something to point out, kind of familiarity with Levis. There's a broad range of hymns in Levis because it's a broad range of Black musical expression of those hymns.
That's right.
So.
Does anybody else have other thoughts?
Michelle, I would just like to thank you. This is maybe
John.
one of the few times in all of my years that you're speaking to something that's so important to me. I've latched onto the spirituals ever since as a little boy. What I do remember in schooling is how difficult it was to sit in music class. I would hide in the back, and the various choirs. Similarly, I'd be there for the social activities, but I've never been able to really enjoy music as we sing it in our hymnal, but the spirituals have always touched me very, very deeply. I play a mountain dulcimer, which is just a few chords, and I'm not talking about the gospel, the white gospel songs. They're nice too, but nothing touches my soul than the simplest of the gospels, of the spirituals. I need to say that because I've kind of been alone my life when I go to music. I can sing these phrases like, "This old hammer killed John Henry. This old hammer killed John Henry, but it won't kill me." That's but one. I just cannot express how the spirituals speak to me in ways that none other music has even touched. So your talk really helps me. And when you talk about music theory, I'm just absolutely hopeless. But you talk about the spirituals, and it speaks to my deepest level. Just the sound of it, not even the theology, going to heaven, although that's my deepest hope. But it's the sound, it's just the tone, it's just some place in a different part of my being is touched that no other sound can reach, or words can reach. Thank you.
Michelle.
Thank you for sharing
John.
that.
So we have Alan and then Liz.
Oh, hey, Alan.
Hi. I've been acquainted with spirituals since grade school. We used to sing arrangements of spirituals, and in high school, of course, we sang these wonderful arrangements. We sang one, I remember, when I was in the All-State Chorus, Connecticut All-State Chorus, in my senior year. I've always suspected that it wasn't really authentic. That it was some white dude that made these kind of sparkly, jazzy arrangements in order to make them a little bit more appealing to his all-white crowd. I was kind of a nonconformist even in my high school days, maybe especially in my high school days. And I wondered, do you know anything about where some of these arrangements came from? Because of course I've heard them, Wade in the Water, Ain't Got Time to Die, all of these things, these beautiful and 4-part harmony, soprano, alto, tenor, bass.
Right.
Where do they come from? Do you know anything about the history and how we got indoctrinated with this ersatz spiritual stuff back through all these school kid choruses?
So Alan is bringing up a really excellent point here. And this is actually something that I was recently talking with some colleagues about. Oh, wait a second. Kitty says she can't unmute because she's on Zoom through her browser, but thank you for, okay. Thank you, Kitty. You bring up a really excellent point. The cultural appropriation conversation, and also why do we do them in the ways that they're done right now? So for example, Moses Hogan, who, like, if you look up choral arrangements of spirituals, the vast majority of them will be written by Moses Hogan, one of my absolute favorite composers of all time, who died at like the age of 47 or something from like a brain tumor. Yeah, D, you're shaking your, yeah. What did he do with the, well, he went to music school and he graduated with all kinds of big fancy degrees, and he wrote these arrangements that are often like We Shall Walk in the Valley of Peace. I think it like splits into like 8 parts, for example. It's SSAATTB. And that's not how they would have sung it, right? And here's a Black composer taking the spiritual and arranging it through his harmonic language as best as he can, as authentically as he can. I feel good about doing the music of Moses Hogan. That feels good to me. Everything needs to be contextualized, I believe. And especially as a person who does lead choirs, when we do pieces like this, I think it's very necessary, especially with pieces like this, to offer contextualization. We often have the same conversations about world music. When you do, okay, we can acknowledge it's important to do Latin American music, South African music, Asian music, that Chinese hymn in our hymnal. That would be really cool to do. How do we do it authentically with our Western instruments? Oh, well, we can't. So I guess we just don't do it. Like, does that become the conclusion? I think it's also interesting to think about, like, what is the historically accurate way of doing? Maybe they did sing spirituals in harmony. We don't have any recordings of the way that they were actually sung on the plantations. I was looking on YouTube. You can find recordings from the 1930s. They're very, very scratchy. But you guys are asking really good questions, and I don't have like answers to these questions, but I think they're really good conversations to explore.
Thank you. Liz, you were next.
Okay. I have always been involved in music, in choruses and bands and orchestras with a clarinet. However, I never got music theory. I mean, it just never was around for me to get. But when I was in the late 40s, growing up in a small town in Ohio, our Methodist church would at least once a year, oftener if we could, invite the choir from a Black Methodist church in Toledo to come and sing. And again, it spoke to me. And I didn't have any sense of this being a different kind of music theory. You know, I didn't know. Of course, I was a kid, I was 4 or 5, but it felt familiar. It felt like I could do this. Yeah. And then when we had cousins in upper West Virginia, and when we would go visit them, we went to their Lutheran church, and their hymnal had all kinds of these hymns, spirituals, and people sang them. Of course, I didn't know whether they were singing them authentically or whether they were singing, but to me, that's always been a huge part of church music. Mm-hmm. Huge. And the other stuff I enjoy, but I'm not equipped to understand it intellectually at all. So to me, gospel is it. spirituals are it. That's all.
Thanks for sharing that. Thanks for sharing that, Liz. I think, yeah.
And I think after your comments, I'm just Anne will be next.
Anne?
Okay. No, after your comments, go ahead, Michelle.
When we talk about music theory, as I said before, we're talking about a very, very specific lens. So maybe you don't feel confident in your understanding of what music theory entails, but you've probably heard the word chord before. You've probably heard the word sharp or flat, or these sorts of things. If we were to look at spirituals from the academic standpoint, from that very singular lens of like through music theory, the way we study music, the way we're taught to appreciate music, the conclusions we might the kind of natural conclusions that might be drawn internally, whether we're whether or not we're brave enough to speak them out loud, is that you can use our sort of Western music theory of the white European musicians in the 18th century to explain spirituals, but the conclusions would be that they're very simple. It's very simple music, right? Oh, okay, well, that's a 1 chord and that's a 4 chord, and then it goes back to a 1 chord, and then there's a 5 chord, and then it goes back to a 1 chord. And I think what I argue is that it does a disservice. It does a really huge injustice. And especially if our internal assumption is that, I don't understand that complicated music, but that simple music I get, but that's somehow simple music to begin with is an assumption that we're making. I argue that it's not simple music. So, this is not like an all composers matter conversation, because the legitimacy of white composers has never been, questioned. It's that this is a lens through. So, for example, perhaps you were taught, as I was growing up, that music has to contain 3 essential components. There has to be melody, there has to be rhythm, and there has to be harmony. Melody, rhythm, and harmony. If it doesn't have those 3 things, it's not music. Well, then by that definition, Gregorian chant isn't music, because there's not really a lot of rhythm. By that definition, Indonesian gamelan ensembles aren't music because there's no harmony. By that definition, rap isn't music because there's no discernible melody. So wait. We're wiping all of these genres aside because we, from this 18th century white European mindset, think that this is what music is about, all music. So I think, again, if you view spirituals through that lens, you're likely to draw conclusions of like, okay, well, that's simple music that like is universal because it's simple, and that all churches can do it, so therefore we should do it because of its simplicity, when there's so much more that we could look at and so much richness, specifically musical richness to it. I think, that's kind of a bigger conversation to be had. Pika's also sharing, I don't know if you guys are seeing the chat here, but some other folks are sharing some interesting comments below. So be sure to check those out. I want to address everybody. Anne had a question. Which Anne?
Me.
Oh, hey.
Hi. Where do the melodies come from?
Anonymous slaves. Anonymous slaves.
Question. I think Anne's asking is there an understanding of the sources of the melodies? For example, in blues, it's one of the streams is call and response music. And of course that shows up in if you listen to Stax records, if you listen to soul music, it's right there. So are there different kinds of streams like that people have identified or think they've identified that would give us an idea of the sources of the melodies? I know some people have gone back to West Africa and sat with musicians and have been able to hear, playing like a 1-stringed instrument with this 1 string stretched over a gourd, and they have been able to, they say, hear the sources, some of the sources.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's what Anne is asking.
Yeah. Dee is writing in the chat that call and response was a big part of spirituals. I would have to agree with that. Call and response was a huge component in terms of the teaching of the spirituals. In terms of the actual music, like the origin of the musical language through which the spirituals are written, certainly, yeah, Africa. We can trace back certain rhythmic patterns to those of African countries, especially as it pertains to Afro-Caribbean music. That is a huge source of study, which we unfortunately do not have time for right now, and I am not an expert in. Neither am I an expert in spirituals, of course. But I think our assumption is that the spirituals were melody. Many of them were in a pentatonic scale. If anybody knows what that is, that's a scale with only 5 notes in it. Probably John Whiting could explain to us more about that. Excuse me. But they're written in what we, through our limited lens, would consider simple scales. And we don't know exactly for sure what the melodies are. So, which is why you'll find, for example, slightly different melodies for This Little Light of Mine. Is it this little light of mine or this little light of mine? You know, there's a lot of different discrepancies there in terms of what the melody for that song would be. This is the case for many spirituals. They were passed down through the oral tradition. One person would start singing, and then the group would respond, and so forth. I'm not sure if that really answers your question, though. Yeah, Mark, you're muted.
Yes. So for those of us who are inspired and want to broaden our exposure, you know, you mentioned that there are thousands of spirituals, and I maybe am familiar with half a dozen. Are there things that you would recommend, recordings or videos, or, you know, just how might we expose ourselves to a wider range of spirituals?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Search for them. Request them.
Are there particular performers or recordings?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're interested in some really, really fabulous arrangements of Moses Hogan, that was the composers that we mentioned earlier, for example, go on YouTube, search up. He actually made his own choir called the Moses Hogan Singers, and they are phenomenal. Dee is typing some things in the chat as well. Fisk Jubilee Singers, she says. You can look up all of these things on YouTube, on Spotify, on Apple Music, wherever you get your music. I can send sort of my oh my gosh, it's been so long since I've been in school. What's the list of things that my citations? Oh my gosh, my citations. Holy crap, it's been so long. You know, I really, really love Joe Carter. He had an On Being episode that was incredibly informative to this talk. So check that out. I stole a lot of his stories. I credit him, but I also stole a lot of his stories in what I shared today. There's some really cool talks on YouTube, specifically within the context of sort of Black History Month concerts, in which people offer descriptions of not only of the pieces of music, but kind of the stories behind them, which I think is always really fascinating. But I would say in terms of like musical recordings that you could really get into, Dee is saying Fisk Jubilee Singers, I'm saying Moses Hogan Singers. Those are two really huge sources. And then in terms of sort of the stories behind them, I would encourage you to look up Joe Carter, and to I can probably provide some other things as well. Let's see, where could I do that? That might have to be in an email, Mark.
And I don't want to I don't want to lose what was being shared in the chat, particularly Pika responded earlier when folks were talking about hearing spirituals in various contexts, that the spirituals were inspired by the suffering of Christ as exposed through biblical teachings and their own suffering. It makes sense that anyone so exposed to human suffering and suffering of Christ would indeed relate to these songs. And why not European Americans in the South, who themselves would have grown up hearing them, particularly when they may not have had a full understanding of the intent of the words themselves. So I think that kind of points to what Michelle pointed of, that kind of place of pain and suffering that everybody has is a place where spirituals can connect, even with I think someone earlier said white choirs can't sing it because they're too stiff. I would suggest that perhaps the invitation of spirituals is to enter into that vulnerable space of letting your body move and sway with the music, even if you don't know how you look, with that freeing yourself from the constraints of what music is supposed to look and sound like, is an invitation that allows choirs to more fully engage in spirituals in a authentic way. What does authentic mean anyway? But kind of in a way that is authentic to themselves, that when we get in touch with our own places of suffering and pain, no matter what our race or where we've come from, it's an authentic expression of spirituals seeking to connect with God, seeking for God to connect with that place of pain in our hearts. So I just wanted to throw my comments in there too. And I think there are a couple of other, in the chat, there are a couple of other resources.
There are a few accounts of white people hearing Black people singing spirituals in Black churches on the few occasions that they have gone into Black churches and experienced this for themselves. And often they will report that the people were moving about really wildly, and it was savage, and it was unrefined, and all these things, because that's not how we do worship. We stay stiff and we worship and like this. And the thought of moving while you're singing, for example, of shouting, of wailing, these are common things that would happen that still do happen in the Black church, especially around the singing of spirituals, that was viewed as this sort of like really like a primitive thing. And I think that's an important thing to understand as well, that is its own small-mindedness of experience, because yes, they do require us to sometimes move and actually feel the music in our bodies physically when we sing them, and to do anything else is, I think, a disservice as well. James Cone, The Spirituals and Blues, is really a great book for one of the pillars of Black theology. Thank you, Dee. Is everybody seeing these things in the chat? Okay.
Roy, I think we have Roy and Martha, and I think that'll be time to wrap it up. Again, this is an invitation to begin a conversation. This is not the end of the conversation at all. So yeah, Roy, go ahead.
Got to unmute. Thank you. What a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. There are two things. One is a little one. I learned in my history of the Anglican Church that emotion was frowned on, not as opposed to other people, but just as emotion. And the stiffness was meant quite intentionally, that you couldn't trust emotion in worship. That was a culture, that was a different culture. I don't see it as narrow focus, but a cultural thing. And though I appreciate your widening focus here, the other thing is, I think for me, the real difficulty is that our general culture doesn't know much about African-American history at all, and the nuances of it. And I don't know that maybe narrowness is a way of expressing ignorance without seeking more information.
We only know what we're exposed to.
What we're exposed to, I think, is what we were exposed to was actually in high school, I'm thinking, a very thin surface history of our own country. We don't even know much of that in general. And we just see almost, at least when I went to high school, it was mostly about politics and the Civil War, but still about politics. But I'm just saying that, and I'm thinking, also, I don't know the context of Mozart, that he was so poor and yet went in such rich circles, and that weird dynamic of how musicians were treated in those days, even brilliant ones. But I appreciate his music. So I'm just saying, I think it's maybe our cultural ignorance, and I emphasize the American part of African, because that's part of my heritage too, and I don't know as much as I want to about it. because I'm influenced by it. And I have been ever since I was very little. So that's all I wanted to share. Thank you.
No, that's really good. Thank you, Roy.
All right, and Martha, you have the last
A
word,
minute?
so to speak.
Oh, okay. Okay. I just wanted to say that 2 years ago, and maybe back 3 and 4 years, we were having regular exchanges with St. Monica's. And when we went to St. Monica's, at least one time, and probably more than that, the choirs joined together. And that included the kids, the Choir School of Hartford. And we sang several hymns and also several spirituals. And I got to tell you, the Choir School of Hartford was getting down. They were having a wonderful time. They were fabulous. The adults were not quite as comfortable with the movement, but we ended up moving a little bit ourselves too. I would love to see that exchange resurrected if we could do that. But it was wonderful, and the kids were right up with it.
Thank you for sharing that, Martha. Yeah. Very cool.
Will the recording be available online? I think so. I imagine so.
Does the recording also grab the text in the chat as well?
No, it does not.
So if there's things that you want to grab in the chat, maybe we should hold this open for a little bit longer. If someone wants to copy and paste things that people have shared in the chat. I know many of y'all are thirsty. This is awesome. You're thirsty for knowledge. Grab stuff. So many people have shared in the chat. This is also, I didn't expect this many people. This is so wonderful. Thank you for staying. Thank you for staying and listening to me talk and then sharing your thoughts. This is such a rich thing to talk about. And I'm so grateful to be able to
It's
share.
worthy of a TED Talk, Michelle.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, I actually Googled TED, spirituals, music, and it doesn't have a lot. I think you should really look into that.
I am not the person for that, I don't think.
I don't know. I felt like I was at a TED Talk.
Oh. Well, thank you.
It was great.
That's very gracious of you.
No, the recording, if we can get the recording of this forum online somehow, I'd like to share it with a lot of my friends, and I think they would really enjoy it.
Yes, I just have to get access to the, we'll probably cut off the Q&A section.
Point.
Yeah, we'll probably cut off the Q&A for the online posting, but it just posts the main sharing
just
part.
The video, yeah.
Yeah, but that's certainly doable. It'll be on YouTube. When it's shared, it'll be on YouTube. So if you can subscribe to the Trinity Hartford YouTube, you'll get a notification when it's posted. All right. Again, thank you everybody for your active participation. Thank you again, Michelle. Continue to be excited by your ministry among us.
Thank you, everyone.
And excited to continue to explore spirituals together as a community, as part of our worship. Someone said the Fisk Jubilee Singers were in Farmington a few years ago. All right. And so with that, if you want to grab stuff from the chat, please do. Otherwise, I hope you all have a great week and have a snowball fight. All right. But no, make sure there's no ice in the snow, though. All right.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
All right. Bye.
Hey, Dee.
Yes.
It's Roy. Maybe you could make a copy of the chat. Because
I was just trying to. It won't allow me to. It's a setting that has to be done when it's when the meeting is set up to automatically save the chat or to allow saving of the chat. And so before I sign out, I'm trying to, but I am not seeing an option to allow me to save it after the fact.
I don't know that I did that option for myself on my Zoom meetings, but every chat from my meeting, if I'm the host, every chat is saved automatically, and it's in my file, it's under Zoom.
Yeah, there's a setting to automatically save chats. And Casey set up these meetings a while ago, so I'm not sure if he enabled that setting or not.
I guess I
so,
did. Okay.
Let's see. Yeah, it won't let me copy it. So.
Well, thanks. This was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. Bye, everyone. Have a good week.
Thanks, Dee. Thanks for organizing all these fabulous sessions.
No, it's not me. It's the Adult Christian Formation. So that's
While you coordinate and facilitate, and your presence alone
okay.
inspire these things. These lectures are lovely, Dee.
And I owe you an email, Pete. I keep meaning to email you to set up a time. So it's on my top of my list for today. Because I want to sit and talk to you some. So all right. Valerie, blessings this afternoon as your family gathers to remember your mom. I will hold you in my prayers. All right, bye, Suzanne. Bye, John.
Bye-bye.